Gospel according to John, chapter 6, verses 1 to 14. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a great multitude followed him, because they saw his miracles which he did on them that were diseased. And Jesus went up into a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. And the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh. When Jesus then lifted up his eyes and saw a great company come unto him, he saith unto Philip, Whence shall we buy bread, that these may eat? And this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, saith unto him, There is a lad here which hath 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes, but what are they among so many? And Jesus said, Make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them that were set down, and likewise of the fishes as much as they would. When they were filled, he said unto his disciples, Gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Therefore they gathered them together, and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which remained over and above unto them that had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the miracles that Jesus did, said, This is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world. There endeth our reading. Thank you, Lord. Amen. As we begin chapter 6 of the Gospel of John, we feel like we're on much more familiar territory comparing the Gospel of John to the synoptic Gospels of Mark, Matthew and Luke. We have already covered the Gospels of Mark and Matthew in the Gospel year, and a miracle that we read of in both Gospels, which is also in the Gospel of Luke, is the miracle represented in today's reading, the feeding of the 5,000, which holds a very special place in the Gospels, as it's the only miracle that is reported in all 4 Gospels. One commentator believes that John, the apostle writing this Gospel, included this miracle in particular because it's a sign of teaching through work, which would be instructive for the faith and the way of living of early Christians, somewhat contrasting to the miracles of healing, which are beautiful miracles that we have seen in the synoptic Gospels, but which perhaps have less of a message of teaching, but more are beautiful to read because of the nature of the compassion that we feel from Jesus to those around him. Also, with the feeding of the 5,000, with the emphasis on blessing the bread and distributing the bread, it leads on to a very hard piece of teaching that Jesus gives to the Galilean Jewish elite later in this chapter, as we'll see. So this chapter of John begins with the phrase, after these things. So that's after that confrontation with the Pharisees and Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. We learn of Jesus returning to Galilee and traveling across the Sea of Galilee from the western side to the eastern side. And Tiberias was a fairly new city that had been built by Herod Antipas and named Tiberias in honor of the Caesar, and lay on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. And we learn here of Jesus going across the sea to the eastern side. Now, a little further on in this reading, we learn that it's the time of the Passover, and so this probably indicates that a year has gone by since our previous reading. We weren't sure exactly which festival was referred to in the beginning of the last chapter, but most commentators think it's the Feast of Purim, which would have taken place in the March. And there is reason to believe that Jesus would have been unable to stay in Jerusalem after that confrontation, and that in fact the time over a 1 year period coming round to the next Passover, the next April, would actually be the time of the great Galilean ministry that we read about in the Synoptic Gospels, which John simply does not describe in much detail, most likely because he wants to write a complimentary account of the life of Jesus. So in terms of harmonization of the Gospel of John with the Synoptic Gospels, that's one interesting idea, that maybe an entire year has gone by. And in the Gospel of Mark, the feeding of the 5,000 occurs shortly after the ministry of the 12 disciples, and also following the news of the beheading of John the Baptist. Similarly, in the Gospel of Matthew, it follows again the beheading of John the Baptist and also the disappointing ministry in Nazareth, where Jesus was not well received by his former townsfolk. But there just isn't time between March and April in the same year for these events to sort of make sense if one's trying to harmonize, and which would explain the idea that an entire year has gone by in which there's generous time for the Galilean ministry to have occurred. And this would explain why a great multitude is following Jesus, because of the great fame that he would have attracted over that period through his healing miracles in Galilee and his teaching, of course. And that's made explicit here by John, because they saw his miracles which he did on them that were diseased. Almost a nod to the Synoptic Gospels. And Jesus and his disciples, having reached the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, go up the steep hillside. It would be more of a high hill than a mountain there on the side of the Sea of Galilee. And John's painting a picture here for us now, saying that the Passover was nigh. That means that there would be a lot of pilgrims passing by. And according to Charles Ellicott, the popular road from the north of Galilee to Jerusalem came down the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. So there would be a stream of pilgrims, and this would explain then why when Jesus lifts up his eyes and looks down toward the lake where the road would be, he sees a great company coming to him. Imagine these pilgrims are making their way to Jerusalem, and then they hear the word goes around that the great prophet, as people might think of him, Jesus of Nazareth, is nearby. Look, he's up on that hillside with his disciples. And by now, all 12 disciples will have joined Jesus after the Galilean ministry, and they would go to him for teaching, possibly for healing too. Now, in the Synoptic Gospel descriptions of the feeding of the 5,000, it's actually the disciples that say to Jesus, how can we feed this multitude? Because they're with him for some time. with teaching and such. And it's a place away from any town, so it's not easy to get provisions. Interestingly, in John, it's actually Jesus that asks this question first, and he addresses it indeed to Philip, who would be in the inner circle as one of the very first of the of the 12 apostles. So that inner group, traditionally we think of James, John, and Peter, and then Andrew. But from the Gospel of John, we also think of Philip being very, very close in that group as a very early apostle. And so Jesus says to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these people may eat?" And it's very nice that we see Jesus using the word we, not you. And that gives us a tiny insight into the day-to-day manner of the relationship between Jesus and his disciples, that it was much more of a brotherhood than you might think. They do address him as Master and Rabbi, but as we know, particularly actually in the Gospel of John, in describing the Last Supper, when Jesus washes the feet of the apostles, he says to them, "You call me Master, and I am your Master, but I'm washing your feet, and this is how you have to be going forward. After I'm gone, you have to serve each other." So he's testing Philip. We see in verse 6, this he said to prove him, prove in the Old English meaning to test. For Jesus himself knew what he would do. And perhaps Jesus is just seeing, does one of his closest apostles have faith that food can be supplied? Maybe remembering the wedding at Cana with the water being turned into wine. But Philip is not up for the challenge on this particular day. He's probably just looking with some fear at, literally thousands of people coming up the hillside. And he answers in a very human way, 200 denarii of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may even have a little. 200 denarii being almost a year's wages, because a denarii was seen as a day's wage for a worker. So not the answer that he might have given, which is Master, Rabbi, faith in God can provide food for all. Now, a nearby disciple, again one of the inner circle, Andrew, and it's interesting how John here refers to him as Simon Peter's brother, as if we were unaware of that, because we are aware of this by this point in the Gospel, but it's just a curious mannerism in the Gospel of John that Andrew's often we're just reminded that he's Peter's brother. Says to Jesus, there is a young lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes, but what are they for so many people? And these touches, the fact that they're barley loaves, and the Greek that's been translated to small fishes actually, interestingly, means a paste made of fish. So it would be like a fish relish made from 2 fishes. And that relish would be eaten with bread as sort of a peasant meal, a poor person's meal, because barley loaves would have been the very cheapest, most basic bread. So it's a very humble amount of food that the lad has compared to the magnitude of the number of people. And then we have the miracle. This is very much in accord now with the Synoptic Gospels. Jesus instructing that the men sit down. There's much grass in the place because it's Passover, April time. It would be grassy there, quite comfortable to sit, and around 5,000 men, not including the number of women and children with them. And Jesus takes the 5 barley loaves, and when he's given thanks, he distributes the bread to the disciples. And let's just have a glimpse at the two Gospels we've already covered in the Gospel year. Let's first of all look at Mark. And the description of the feeding of the 5,000 is in chapter 6 of Mark. And in particular, let me just read verse 41. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, he looked up to heaven and blessed, and brake the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fishes divided he among them all. So, a nice narrative there from Mark. Jesus looking up to heaven, blessing and breaking the loaves. And then in Matthew, this would be in chapter 14 of Matthew, and in particular, verse 19, the equivalent verse. And he commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass, and took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and brake, and gave the loaves to his disciples, and the disciples to the multitude. And I won't read the equivalent passage from Luke because we haven't covered that yet in the Gospel year. We'll be covering the Gospel of Luke in the late autumn. So quite interesting and pleasant to compare this key action of the miracle amongst the Gospels. And I think it was when I was covering the Gospel of Mark that I spoke about, as a physicist, about the nature of miracles and what would be the physical nature of creating essentially bread. And that, interestingly, being a creation of matter is something that comes from relativity theory, energy and mass being equivalent, so in the realm of nuclear physics. Just pointing that out in terms of a scientific reflection, not in any way suggesting that any kind of nuclear physics actually occurred here. It's one of those miracles where it's hard to visualize it. We can visualize Jesus healing someone. We can visualize Jesus calming the sea. It's hard to visualize this particular miracle. And I think because of that, for those witnesses, it was so extraordinary, as we'll see. The people are filled, and again, a slight difference here. In the Synoptic Gospels, we just learn that the disciples gather up the fragments. Here in John, we learn that Jesus asked them for them to do that, to gather up the fragments. And so it's the word of Jesus here that nothing be lost, that these valuable resources, even though they can be made by the Son of God, but they're valuable, they should not be squandered. Very interesting lesson there. And 12 baskets are gathered with the fragments of the barley loaves remaining over from that which was eaten. And as I've mentioned before in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, the number 12 here referring pretty clearly to the 12 disciples and also possibly the 12 tribes of Israel, but one can take these numerical allusions too far. It may simply be that each disciple had a basket and went around collecting fragments. Now, something we see here in John that is absent to some degree, not as explicit in the Synoptic Gospels, is the fact that such was the extraordinary nature of this miracle that it really created a desire for this multitude to pronounce Jesus essentially king. They say, "This is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world," and that prophet being a form of words for the Messiah used in the Pentateuch, in particular in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18. In fact, I'll read the preceding verse 17. "And the Lord said unto me, They have well spoken that which they have spoken. I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren like unto thee, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him." So only reading out that verse to indicate that for the people, not the very learned Pharisees and Sanhedrin, but for the people that would flock to John the Baptist, that would flock to Jesus, they would not have a fine-tuned sense of the difference between the return of Elias, the return of the Messiah, the creation of a great prophet. All of these things would somewhat meld into one, which is the language here then, that prophet that should come into the world, a form of words meaning the Messiah, and they very much wanting that Messiah to take the form of King David. So they have that in common, on average, generally with the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin, of a great king that will reinstitute or reconstitute Israel as a nation above all nations.